Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome along to DBA Fundamentals Down Under for the month of June. We are starting and we've still got some more people filing in, so that's okay. Once again, my name is Warwick Rudd and I'm your host this month. And for this month, we've got Greg Lowe talking to us about tips and tricks for using SQL Server Management Studio. Now, before I do hand over to Greg, I do have some housekeeping to run through. Just to let you all know, this session is being recorded and will be made available on the DBA Fundamentals website in a couple of days' time, where you can come back and see this recording at any point in time. Now, before we do continue, I do want to have a call out to a couple of the local SQL Saturday events, which are coming up in between this session and our next month's session. And that is, we've got SQL Saturday Melbourne on the 30th of June. And you can see here the event homepage for you to register. And the following weekend after that in Melbourne, we've got SQL Saturday 771. So if you are in the local area and you want to come along and you haven't registered already, make sure you do register and you'll be able to actually have a chat to both Greg and I, as we both will be presenting at those events. You may be aware, with past Summit quickly approaching, if you haven't already registered for the Summit, tickets do increase at the end of this month on the 29th of June by a further $300. Now, on this page here, you will see we have got two access codes that you can use. The first one, VGSTRM843, that will actually get you access for the Summit sessions in a streaming view. Or you can take advantage of VGDISM843 and get a $150 discount off. And so if you take advantage of that by the 29th of June, you can save yourself $450 for your registration tickets to Summit. Without any other time up, I will hand over to Greg to take us through this afternoon's session.
Hi folks, how are we doing? So listen, I'm Greg, for those that don't know me, and quick background, I head up a company called SQL Down Under in Melbourne and long-term data platform MVP, I think since about 2000, and part of the Microsoft Regional Director Program, which basically just gets me on, I think, a whole lot of interesting mailing lists inside Microsoft, and been involved with the product a long time. I started working in SQL Server about 1992, and I do a bunch of writing, and we produce tools and a variety of things. And so look, what we're going to cover off, things around Management Studio. Now, this product obviously hasn't been there since the start. Originally, there was a thing called SQL Admin Facility, SAF, and then later we ended up with Enterprise Manager and Query Analyzer were two separate tools. And then eventually in SQL Server 2005, it became Management Studio. And what I find is obviously a lot of people have worked with it for a very long time since then. But what I find is a lot of people don't particularly work with it all that well. And there's so many more things you can do with it. And often I'm hoping that as we go through this session, there'll be at least a couple of things that you look and go, oh, I didn't know I could do that. And so what we're aiming to do is sort of increase your ability to use the tool effectively. And so I've also got these detailed down. And so I'll just mention there, I've done an ebook on this. Every Thursday, I've been doing posts on my blog for basically what are shortcuts, but they're things about using Management Studio. And so I'll give you a link at the end, but again, so ssmsbook.sqldownunder.com is a way you can get hold of all of the things that we're talking about here, and there's a couple of hundred pages of them. Alrighty, so let's take a look. So first thing, with Management Studio, you'll notice that when you start it up now, it doesn't have a version that's related to SQL Server. This one says version 17.7 when it starts. And so it no longer says SQL Server 2016 or SQL Server 2014 and so on. It's unrelated to that. And it's just a series of versions. So they've decoupled Management Studio from the installation of SQL Server. They did that in SQL Server 2014 with SQL Server Data Tools. That became a separate install to SQL Server. And in SQL Server 2017, for example, now if you install it, you'll find there's a link to get Management Studio, but it's not one of the things that's installed. Now, this is really important because we can now get a lot of changes very, very quickly into Management Studio that we used to wait for years and years and years for these things to happen. And what would happen in the past is we'd get a new version with each version of SQL Server. We'd squirrel down all the things that we want to have in the product, and we'd hope like crazy. And in a couple of years' time, we'd look and go, oh, we got a couple, we didn't get some, and so on. The difference now, I've had things that I've sent to Ken Van Heining and his team, the guys doing the Management Studio stuff, and literally a couple of weeks later, it's sitting there in the product. I can't begin to describe how important that is, that this is now decoupled and has a team working very hard on it all the time. Alrighty, so let's take a look at this. So I'll connect here now that we know about versions. Now, the first thing, just want to show you a couple of things around Object Explorer. Now, one of the ones that people have sort of known about for some time, and it's often a neat little trick the first time you ever see it, was the idea that you can drag names out of here and sort of use that to avoid typing the name for sure. And you've had the ability as well, if I'm writing a query against a table, so for example, if I look in here at Wide World Importers, and we look at these, I've got, say, purchase order lines, let's go there. And so if I said, look, select Asta from purchasing purchase order lines, and we make sure we're in Wide World Importers, be a good start. And okay, so that's fine. But if I hover over the asterisk, I get a list of, it knows what all those columns are that are sitting under there. But people have had the, how do I get all of those out there? Or if I want to use most of them. And one thing a lot of people hadn't realized is that as well as being able to drag out columns, you can actually drag the word columns out in there, and that'll sort of pop in a list of all the names. Now, some people would know that, but one of the things that they might not have realized is that this has actually been updated quite a bit in recent times. And so, for example, if I go to the Wide World Importers DW database, and this one has, because it's a data warehouse, we've actually done it with a whole lot of columns that have, for example, spaces in the names. And so notice as I bring those out, what it now does is it surrounds these, it quotes them, but it only quotes the ones that have spaces in the name. And so if I have something in here that doesn't have them, for example, like this here, and let's pop that in there and go to the front, you'll notice the date wasn't quoted and day number was, day and month are not quoted and so on. Now look, this is a step forward from where we were, and you can control that behavior. So under Tools, Options, and this is actually under Object Explorer, then Scripting, under Commands, and what there's an Options in here. And so we've got this surround object names with brackets when dragged. And so the default used to be that everything had square brackets around it. Now you can control that. I've turned that off. And then what it does is only puts it around things where there are embedded spaces. Now that's not quite the whole story, because clearly, note this word is blue. This is actually the name of a function and so on. It doesn't sort of, deal with the fact that maybe, I've called a column order by, that's clearly, that, or order. These sort of things would still be problematic. And so it'd be nice if it understood reserved words and so on. Doesn't quite do that yet, right? But this is a big step forward over where we were. Now, another one while we're in Object Explorer, I see people often trying to script out more than one object at the same time. So for example, if I look at this purchase order lines, we'll notice that there are a number of indexes here. Now, so for example, imagine I'm thinking about creating a new index and I'm wondering what columns are in those indexes that are already there. And so I could right click each one of these. And so I could say, look, give me properties. And then I can look at the columns and so on that make that up. The other approach I see people take is they right click these and go script index as create a new query window. and that'll give you that index. That's fine. But what I really want is I want all the indexes. Now, the way you can do that is that if I click on this word indexes, if I hit F7, that opens up the Object Explorer details window. Now, this is one that's been around quite a while, but I find people don't tend to use it. And yet it's actually kind of a neat thing. So for example, if you have a long list of things in here, you can click on the name and then you can actually start typing and it'll automatically do a multi-character search right to the thing you're looking for. And so I typed P in this case, but if I type PK_P, it would have gone straight there. So it's not just a single character give me the starting thing going on here. And the other thing I can do in here is there's operations that I can do on the whole lot of these. So for example, if I click and shift click here, I can then say script index as create to new query window. And what that'll give me is that'll give me the details of all the indexes. And so this is a world of goodness when I'm trying to look at what's there to try and work out maybe if I'm looking at building another index, knowing what's already inside that. Now, this Object Explorer details window is also useful for a number of other things. So give you an example here. So if I took tables in Wide World Importers and hit F7, what this will give me is it's giving me the name, the schema, and so I could sort by the name or sort by the schema and so on. And it's got a column here, say policy health state. Now, I find most people don't tend to use policy. That appeared back in SQL Server 2008, but I find it's not a heavily used thing. So anyway, look, that column's there. Create date, most of the time, if I've run a script to create the thing, they're all pretty much going to be the same time, although that might be of interest to some people. But importantly, note you can add other columns here. So let me get rid of policy health state, and then I can add this and say, look, much more interested in, give me the space used, and give me the index space used, and maybe give me a row count or something like that. Now this is way more interesting. And so all of a sudden I can sort of click on a list of tables here and objects and sort of look at the size that's occupied by those. I love the fact that this is available right in here. And as I said, I can then sort of look at some other database, look at tables, hit F7, and here's then the space that's occupied by those. And easily I can also sort those. So I could say, give me biggest to smallest. And so this will then give me the largest tables on down. So now there are plenty of other ways of getting that via this built-in reports and things, but this is a really, really convenient thing having it directly there. Now, also in here, it's got the ability to filter this as well. And so I could say, look, I'm only interested in the sales schema. And so I could put that in and just limit it to sales. I've also got, I could sort of clear the filter. The other place I can do the filtering too, might add, is when you're over here, you can also right click at this level and say filter, and there are filter settings here as well. So whenever you sort of look at Object Explorer, if you think, look, this is a really, really busy set of stuff I've got going on here, you do have the ability to go and sort of filter that to just look at specific ones. What I would love, I must admit, is the ability to have these structured by schema, and that's not currently available in here, but again, it would be a nice addition, maybe one day. Now, another one while we're in here is I often get people wanting to generate insert scripts for tables. And so now notice here, let's say payment methods. If I right click on payment methods, I can say script as create, or I could say script as insert. And what that's going to do is script me an insert statement, but that's not really what I want. What I actually want is all of the data scripted as a series of inserts. Now there's various ways of doing this, but people often don't realize there's a built-in method for doing that. And so all you need to do is up at the database level, unfortunately not quite as obvious, we basically say tasks, and then in here there's generate scripts. And so what we're going to do is just generate scripts. Now, I could pick particular objects here. So I could say, look, just give me, let's say, payment methods. And then the tricky one here is we've got to click advanced. And once we go into advanced, there's a number of things in here which are quite interesting. So first up, the SQL Server version. And so notice it's got the ability to script for other versions. Now, this goes back to SQL Server 2005 in the scripting. It's worth noting that this version of Management Studio, these ones, they support all supported versions. And at the moment, that's SQL Server 2008 forward. I would suggest if you're working with SQL Server 2005, that you continue using the older version of Management Studio. So for example, I know that the new version of Management Studio could screw up schedules for jobs and things like that if you start playing around with 2005, because 2005 didn't understand things like different schedules for different steps in a job and so on. So back in that version, keep using 2005. Most things will work, but there's some stuff I found that doesn't play nicely. However, if you're working with SQL Server 2008 and later, there's now no reason to have the different versions of Management Studio installed. In fact, you can just have the current version. This one here was 17.7. Very soon there'll be a version 18. And those sort of versions work across all the different versions at the same time for all the supported versions. But anyway, so this allows you to generate scripts for that. There are also the ability to script for different editions in here, and for the type of instance. So this is Azure SQL Database or standalone. So the aim is here to not have statements that won't work with those other versions. But the one that we're looking for here is, instead of schema only, we've got options here to say data or schema and data. So in that case, I could say, look, just script me the data only. And I could say, pop that in a new query window, and that'll run that. And finish. And so you'll notice in here that this has now scripted out the insert statements. It might not be exactly like I'd like them, but at least it does a reasonable job. For example, I'd love it if they actually put semicolons in there and so on. But anyway, so look, there are things it's a good starting point. You don't get a lot of control over it, but it is a very, very good starting point, being able to do this. Now, while we're in here, just show you a few things with the sort of editing in here. If I said, look, for example, I really wish those semicolons were there, then notice if I go Control H, we've had search and replace, but what a lot of people don't realize in this window over here is that there's a regular expression button here. Right? So in this case, I could click that, and then in here I could say, look, wherever you see a new line, so I've gone \R, I could say, give me a semicolon and a \R, and I could replace all, and that would give me my those there. Now, the other thing I could do is maybe say, look, I don't actually want all those goes in there. So I could say, look, wherever I have go, actually, let's say return and then go, and then, oh, it was actually, yeah. In fact, let's just actually replace go semicolon. I could sort of nuke that out at the moment. And I could also do things like I could say, look, where there's double carriage returns, just give me one. Yeah, oh, actually, that didn't find that one. What have I got in there? But anyway, so the thing is, you can build this out. Now, one of the things I use this for all the time is that thing with tabs and spaces. There's no right or wrong answer with tabs and spaces, but what you'll find, I tend to like to work with spaces all the time. Some people just love working with tabs, but when they give me a script that's been built that way, it's a right pain in the neck. Even if I have it configured in Tools Options to work with spaces, it doesn't convert scripts that you load up. Again, I wish it did. But what you can do is say, look, wherever you see a tab, then what I want you to do here instead is replace that with 4 spaces. And if I go and do that, anyway, that would replace any tabs. Let's get rid of him. That would replace any tabs with the equivalent number of spaces. And so I find that really, really useful as well. But just keep in mind, there's a heap of things you can do with this when this sort of works in a regular expression mode. It's a little weird when you go to turn it off. Notice I click on it and nothing happens, but as soon as you tab out of it, it then sort of goes off and turns that. Now, also, actually, while we're on the subject of Go, let's actually just quickly talk about that. Now, one of the things that there've been a number of blog posts and things over the years, and it's describing that Go isn't a SQL keyword, right? So if I have, the important thing to understand here is that if I do this, and let's say I say print hello and Go, and then I say print there and Go. Now, if I just click execute, what happens is it looks like this entire script gets run. But really what happens under the covers is that Management Studio finds the word Go, and so it considers this thing a whole script, but it finds everything up to that Go, and then it sends that to the server, waits for that to complete, then it finds the next Go, and so it'll get this chunk of stuff and send that to the server and wait for it to complete, and then it'll send this here, including that space, to the server and wait for it to complete, and same with this. Now, so what's actually happening is it's doing a whole lot of round trips to the server. Importantly though, Go never got sent to the server. In fact, if you ever try and send that to the server, you find it doesn't know what you're talking about. So if I said, for example, exec Go, then it'll come back and say, look, what? I don't know that stored procedure. Okay? So I've actually sent the word Go to the other end. So it doesn't know what that is. So anyway, so important. Now, it is possible to change it. A lot of people sort of show you that over the years. If I come in here to query, I can, in Tools Options, change that to something else, right? My favorite is a Star Trek mate who changes them all to engage, right? And then you can have the word engage in your scripts instead of having Go. Scripts are not much use for anybody else, right? If you do that. And the one that they usually say is pretty funny is to put something like select or order by or something like that in there and just confuse the life out of new people because they won't have any idea what's going on. Anyway, but given the fact that Go is a special word that's only understood by the tools, it never is sent to the server. But the other thing is, it's had the ability for quite a long time now to have a number added to it as well. So if I said, for example, Go 10, and then I execute this, so notice what it'll do is it'll sort of run that. Now, same thing here. If I ran the whole thing, it's done the print of the hello, come back, and then it's printed. Management Studio has printed that, and then it's executed the print statement 10 times, and then it told me it completed that. So there's no thing going on at the SQL Server end here. It's just that Management Studio has sent that batch of commands 10 times. Notice the red squiggle here, because it has no idea syntax-wise what's going on there with that either. Alrighty. Now, while we're in this screen editing, I'll show you a couple of things in here too. One that a lot of people don't seem to understand is the idea that F1 is useful for a whole lot of finding out info. So for example, if I highlight this entire lot here, if I go Alt F1, and what that's doing is it's looking for the details in the database. Now, if I'm in the right database here and then hit Alt F1, so notice what it'll do is it'll run the equivalent of an SP help against that table. And so that'll tell me details of the table, the list of the columns, identities, file group, things like that. This is kind of neat. The other thing is that if I was just using a function like len, for example, notice if I highlight that and hit F1, that's the way we now normally get to the help system. And so I always thought it was a good idea to have the books online installed on the local machine. Nowadays, I tend to think it's better to just use the online one every time if you have any way of doing that. Now, they've also changed the format of these in recent years. You may or may not have noticed, but in older versions of these pages, what they used to do is they had a separate page for each version of SQL Server, where notice now, this says, here are the versions that this applies to. Right? And the nice thing with this is then you get a single page, and if something is different between the different versions, it gets discussed down here inside the context. And so the nice thing with that is you're not jumping from page to page to try and work out what was it that was different in the different ones. Another thing that's really, really useful with this is now if you don't like what you see on these pages, you can change it. And so notice here, so Ed, in fact, this is a page I picked because this is one I changed myself, but the idea is you can go in and make changes. So if notice I can click edit, and this has become really, really easy to do. And it's because Microsoft documentation has all moved basically up into GitHub. And so notice here, I've then got the content of the page. I could say, look, I want to edit this. Now, because I don't have write permission, it's going to do what's called a fork of the project and then give me my own fork. And then down in here, I can come in and make changes to this. And then down the bottom, I describe why I want to make the change and what I'm doing and click Propose File Change. It'll then check to see that it's okay to make that change. And then it gives you an option to create what's called a pull request. You just send that. And what then happens is that goes straight to the inbox of someone who's able to modify that page. So I tend to get an email back from them immediately saying, look, thanks for the little change. If I did a lot of stuff inside here, I get an email back asking me to agree to a licensing thing, basically, which is like, you know, I'm okay to let you have that code without strings attached. And either way, then it goes off to the person who owns the page, and they'll usually I find within a couple of days they will have read it. They might come backwards and forwards and discuss it with you, and then they'll go on and sort of merge that into the code. This is a thing of beauty, the fact that we can now come in and sort of modify this stuff and have the changes done. Over time as well, if you want, you can sort of look at your profile, and what that'll do is sort of show you a map of things like when have you been making changes and what changes have gone on, and you know, does that look right? So anyway, look, I encourage you to do that. Now, another one while we're in here is there's also a lot of people don't seem to understand the way we can do rectangular selection. So for example, if I said, look, I want to insert this not into application payment methods, but I want to insert it into some other table name, I could go in there and start changing each one of these, or I could do a Control H to replace. But notice that I can also, whenever I'm in something like this, I can go across here, but I can also go Alt Shift and then go down and select a sort of a rectangular selection. And as I do that, then I can type over the top of that. So new methods, for example, and type and backspace and so on. That all just works a treat. And the beauty of this is it allows you to make really, really significant changes very, very easily. So for example, I could come in here and say, for some bizarre reason, I want those all to be semicolons, right? So this sort of thing works great. So that rectangular selection is really important as well. Now, while we're in this editing area here, again, notice it's having a squiggle here going, what's that object name? If I've executed code and it hasn't updated the IntelliSense yet, always keep in mind that under Edit IntelliSense, there's an option here to refresh the local cache, but that one's a really good one to know in the back of your mind. So Control Shift R is the thing that'll cause it to refresh the cache in case you've just executed something and the cache doesn't know about it as yet. Now, while we're in this screen as well, one of the things that changed a few versions back, I think it was when they went to Visual Studio 2015 shell, is that normally when you're editing like this, you would see over on the right-hand side here quite a little mess in the scroll bar. Now I've turned it off, but let me just go in here and show you what's in there. So if I had left annotations turned on, what that would do is it would start showing me red areas, for example, where there are syntax errors in here. And if I had made changes that were okay but hadn't been saved yet, then what I would see in those, so if I said, look, give me this, actually let me grab this one, and so on, these sort of changes, you'll start to get things indicating all the time. Now, what the thing, and so notice this is all yellow here. So this is indicating that this is a change I've made, but I haven't yet saved it. And if I had done a save, then I would have this as green. And so the bits that were changed and saved would be green and so on. Now, the only thing I find is that eventually it starts to get harder and harder and harder to find where the cursor is. Now, the cursor's the blue thing here, and yeah, that's okay. But I find when it gets really, really crowded, finding that is often very difficult. The other thing, if you do have a, let's say a fairly long script, so let me just grab something that looks a bit longer. Let's grab a stored proc of some size. This will do. In fact, let me get invoice picked orders. I don't know, let's just pick one anyway. So something with a bit more code in it. Now, one of the problems is that as your scripts get longer and longer, it gets harder and harder sometimes to work out where you are in the script and what you're doing. So another thing is that instead of just this scroll bar mode, where it had those options, what we can also do is you can turn on map mode instead of bar mode. And so if I turn on map mode, and we can see how big the source is, and I'll show in a sec. Notice that what it gives you is a sort of a tiny little sort of glimpse of what the code actually looks like. And then the nice thing is that as you hover over this, you can sort of scroll down and see which part of the code you're looking at. And I could say, yep, that's the bit I'm after, and then click on it, and that would take you straight to it. So if you've got really, really long chunks of code, this map mode can actually be really useful for finding that other part of the code that you're looking for. And again, it's another one that I find people are just not aware of. Anyway, so let's go back to bar mode, and I'll kill off those annotations just for now. All right, now in terms of the few other things in around here in Object Explorer, whenever I'm working with, say, a table, one of the questions that comes up, you might say, well, what about how do I find things that depend on that table or things that that table depends on? Now, if you go back in earlier versions of SQL Server, there was a thing called SP depends. SP depends. And it was famous for trying to show you dependencies between things. But the other thing it was famous for is it just seemed to lie, right? And so the problem here is it's not so much it lied, it just didn't know the whole story. And so if, for example, I said create proc blah, and I said, look, select Asta from dog or something, it doesn't know what dog is, but it would let me create that procedure, right? It just thinks that, oh, dog is something I'll know about in the future. And so this is a sort of a deferred name resolution that goes on in procedures. The problem with SP depends is that later when you create a dog, it wouldn't remember that blah was dependent on dog. So that would be a problem. Now in SQL Server 2012, they added some dependency views and they now track partial dependencies inside the product. And why this is a world of goodness is that there are views you can use to look at those dependencies, but also in here, if I go view dependencies, this is now real goodness compared to what we had before. And so I can look at objects that depend on employee, and so all these things use employee, or I could find things that employee depends upon as well. And so keep these in mind because this now actually tells the truth. And so this is actually a really, really good option inside here. A few more inside Management Studio and Object Explorer here. If I right click, let's say a database, and notice there's reports, there's a whole series of standard reports. Now, I find people haven't really looked at these terribly well. I'd encourage you to do so. There's an amazing amount of information just built into the standard reports that are already sitting inside the system. And so notice this one showing me the space used for different things. In here, it's noticing there were no auto grow or auto shrink events. Otherwise, it would show you when they occurred. Shows you the space used by files and so on. This is kind of neat. And many of these reports are also linked to other reports. This is actually quite neat. But one thing to keep in mind is that you've also had the ability to build your own reports. So for example, if I come here and I say reports, and so notice I say custom reports, then what I can do is build an RDL file, so a standard reporting services report. I treat this as I'm already in the right security context and I'm already talking to the database. So the data source becomes very simple. And then you set up a set of parameters and it'll pass you which object, which schema, it passes you that sort of detail. And then you can have a report that depends on the thing you clicked on. Now this one here just is a simple example that just lists the databases, but the idea is you can do pretty much anything with those sort of reports. And look, the very first time you run it, it's going to give you a warning because you're running code from somewhere else, and it's worried this could be a Trojan report or something. But the idea after that is that if you right-click again at that level, notice that that report I put here is now one of the reports listed under here as one that I've recently run, and it's quite cool. And the idea is that if I right-click on, say, a column, you'll notice it's not there. If I right-click on a table, where's reports? Notice it is here, and this is because at some stage I have run it at the table level. It tries to remember which reports you've run at which level. Alrighty. Now, a couple more while we're inside here. You may have noticed, I suppose, the size of the text I've got here is quite large, and people realize it's pretty easy to increase the size of the text. Keep in mind that if you're needing to do that temporarily, instead of coming in here into tools, options, and then diving into fonts and colors, where we normally do this, what you could do, of course, is just the zoom down the bottom here, or hold down Control and scroll your mouse. I mean, that works fine too. Or you could manually zoom inside here. So the zoom features are quite reasonable now. And the other one, just while we're at it, let me show you an example here. If I open up a previous project, let's find, yeah, that one will do. I tend to make use of script projects as well. I'd encourage you to do that. That allows me to group together all the scripts for a certain type of operation. And notice I've also in here got a series of text files and things that I can use to keep notes and so on. Now, when I go to create that, notice if I right click, you can't go new text file. But what you can do is I can say new query, and then I can rename it to text, and then it'll drop it down here. Or the other alternative is up here. I could go add existing item, and I could add Word documents, web pages. I can add all sorts of things inside here. But anyway, so let me just get an example here of a query, because I just want to show you in here. Now, if I take a query plan, so look, give me an estimated plan for this. And notice this is a slightly larger plan. And it can be sort of awkward navigating around inside here. Now, a lot of people would use SQL Sentry's Plan Explorer or something like that. The free version of that is quite common. But even just in here, trying to find your way around can get messy. But I think one of the least discoverable pieces of UI inside Management Studio is this little button right down here in the corner. There's a little plus sign. And if you click on that, it allows you to sort of navigate around inside the query plan. And I often find that's enough to find me things like thick lines going into thin lines and so on. It's often enough to start finding that. But again, it was just, I don't know who thought that was a great idea to hide that down there, but I find so many people just completely unaware that it's there. Alrighty. Now, also in terms of zooming and fonts and so on, another one up here, this thing here is a quick find thing. So notice it's got the tab that I went looking for before. That's there. And so these are things I've searched for. But notice there's a quick launch up here. Now, this one is one people don't seem to understand. And so what this one is about searching things like the object layouts and stuff inside Management Studio. So this is searching within Management Studio instead of searching within the script. So for example, if I type, say, font, what this is going to do is show me the things inside Management Studio here that's got something to do with fonts. So if you can't remember, you know, it's tools, options, oh my goodness, where is this thing? This is actually way cool because I can type sort of the thing I'm looking for, And that tells me there are fonts in environment, fonts and colors. I can turn on presentation mode, and this is turning it off and so on. And this is actually way cool for finding things. So if you just cannot remember where something is, that's often the quickest way to find it now. Now, while we're in here, I just mentioned presentation mode. This is one that seemed like a great idea. Not so much for my money. So what happens is they realize it's really, really good to be able to change all your fonts when you need to do a presentation. And so they put an option here, and you can configure what you want the presentation fonts to look like using this present edit. You turn on presentation mode, it sets all the fonts that way, but notice the only option for turning it off is restore default fonts. And they don't mean restore the fonts I had before, they mean set it all back like you'd never configured anything in the machine. I just so wish it didn't say that, right? What it needs is a present off mode that turns it back the way it was in the first place. So it seems like a feature that, yeah, not a bad idea, but I think it just sort of missed the point a bit in that one. And look, the easiest way often to do this is also to have a separate login into your machine. So instead of your normal login, where you've got mail and things and all these things down the bottom here, another option to keep in mind is you could just create a separate login into your machine, which is your demo person or something you're going to use to show the people in the office something. But the nice thing with that is it then means you're not killing off notifications and all those other sort of things. You could just have a high DPI font and different fonts and everything set up in that other screen, and then when you log on as that, it would already have that. And I think often that's actually a better way to do it. Now, while we're in here too, this is actually a light theme. Notice there's in Tools Options, there's also under General a color theme. So notice there's a blue and a light. What is missing there is there's normally a dark theme. And so in Visual Studio, that isn't currently supported for Management Studio. One of the things I put in the book is a description that tells you how to enable it if you really, really want to enable it, because there's a configuration file where they've just disabled this stuff. Now, the reason I think they've done that is they just haven't made everything work with it. And so if you set it to dark by enabling that, what I found is that Object Explorer, for example, just doesn't work properly. So it becomes black, but when you right click on things, the writing is in black as well. And so, oh my goodness, that's not what we want. But if you really, really, really are intent on editing in a dark theme, it does work. And I mean, you can actually have a version of it configured for that, and you could spend your day writing code in a dark screen. If that's what you really want to do, that actually works great. Now, another thing in that too, they've disabled macros and a number of other things. Somewhere along the way, I will get time to sort of experiment and try and work out what happens if you re-enable macros, because I've always been surprised that they're not part of Management Studio, because it would be so useful. But while we're in here, look, a couple of others. If I'm in here making changes into one of these things, and let's say, and I want to sort of undo stuff, then let's do this here. So if I said, look, let me knock this out and knock that out and so on, and I've done a couple of levels. Now I can do Control Z the whole way and sort of try and work out where I was up to. But one of the things that they normally have in Visual Studio that isn't normally in Management Studio is a multi-level undo and redo. So notice here I can go and say, take me back 2 steps, and that'll take me to there. And then I can also say reapply multiple steps if I want to. Now, they aren't normally there. I have no idea why. So anyway, if you right click out here and go customize, on commands, the one you're interested in is edit. And if you say add new command and we go to edit, then way down inside here, you'll find there's a multi-level redo and multi-level undo. And I would strongly suggest you just pop them up onto your toolbar because they're so powerful. I did sessions all over the world with people on what's new in SQL Server 2012. And the surprising thing, the best reaction from a crowd in every single location was the fact that in integration services, the designer for that, the undo now actually worked. Right? Now you'll never see that in a brochure, in a marketing brochure, but the thing is that it really had a big impact on people, the fact that undo worked properly. Now having this multi-level undo, this is a world of goodness. Now, while we're in here too, another one that people often don't get is the clipboard ring. So notice here, as well as paste, Control V, there's a cycle clipboard ring, Control Shift V. So what this does, let me show you this. So if I said, look, copy, I've gone Control C, I've gone Control C, Control C, and Control C. The problem is I see people jumping all over the place to copy because they don't think they have in the clipboard at the moment the thing they want to paste. But notice if I go Control Shift V, it shows me the last one. If I still keep holding Control Shift and hit V again, it'll show me the different ones, right? And I could say, yep, that's the one I want. Yeah, oh, sorry. And let me paste that again. So I could say, that's the one I want. And then I could do, again, look for different ones I've used and so on. These are all still present in the clipboard ring. And so Control Shift V is one of your friends. Also, if you're looking to try and write code, I often struggle with trying to remember the syntax of various things. So even though I work with the product for forever, for example, if I go to create a function, I often have to think, is this an inline scalar function or a table valued function? Just trying to think of like, what's the syntax for that? Now, the easiest thing for that, I could use a template. Right? We have a template explorer you can open up, but the one that I think is the best of the lot now are the snippets, and these appeared a couple of versions back. But if I go Control K, Control X, notice it says insert snippet, and I could say function, and I want an inline table function. I go clunk, and it goes, here's a layout for one. And I could say this is sales. Notice if I tab, get something, tab, this parameter. Notice as I tab, it changes those. This is a world of goodness. And escape stops it doing the highlighting and thing. But just keep in mind that snippets are incredibly useful for doing that sort of thing. Now, another thing too, while we're at it in here, is that if I highlight something like this, actually, let me just grab that. There's also surround with. So notice if I right click here, there's surround with, and that's Control K, Control S, and it says, look, surround that with, I don't know, a begin. Yeah, and so that'll actually pop a begin end around it. Again, I wish there was a semicolon here, but anyway, beggars can't be choosers. So, but the idea is that there are things that can surround the current block of code with bits of things from snippets as well. Alrighty, now what have we covered there? Yep, that's all good. Now, the last couple of things, getting tighter time-wise, a couple of things I want to show you. One is that if you look at query results on Tools, Options, Query Results, let's have a look here. One that a lot of people aren't aware of is there's a play default Windows beep when a query batch completes. So I often leave things running, and I think I keep flipping back or looking up at the heading to see if it's still executing. It is actually neat to get it to sometimes do a beep when a long running query finishes. What I would love though, because so many things in Windows beep, I do wish I could pick an appropriate MP3 or something and say, look, or a WAV file and say, please play this. Then I could know that it wasn't just something in the email that I'm editing that caused that beep. I do wish that was a different one. But anyway, there is a thing there that can actually make that beep when it finishes running. So that's sort of useful. Now, when you make connections to SQL Server, a few things here too. So first up, if I say, look, database engine query, keep in mind, when I go to connect to the server, there are options as well. And so the first one, it's a little bit interesting, is that I could say, look, pick a color, and then what that's going to do is change the color down the bottom. And every time I connect to that server, it's going to use that same color on my machine. So perhaps I could say, look, this is my production machine. I want to use the red version here. Look, it works pretty good. It's not as good as the ones that are in the SSMS toolkit, but it's for built-in free. It's not too bad what's there. The other thing you can do is that sometimes you're looking at adding additional parameters into the connection. So just be aware this is here as well. And so I could say something like multi-subnet failover is true, and I could have that added to my connection string. So if I'm trying to test something with high availability, for example, where I've got a multi-subnet high availability setup, or listeners in 2 different subnets, I can do things like use these parameters to change it. Now, the other thing is any of the other parameters that are part of the connection as well, if you put them in here, so if I go semicolon something else, it will overwrite the ones that are elsewhere in there. So keep in mind you can do that with connections. And so sometimes that's actually really useful. The final one I want to show you with this too is that we still have the ability to say view registered servers. And so in here, I can create groups of servers. So in this case, I've said, look, development servers are HR server and sales server. So I just right clicked and said new server group. And then I added a server to the group. Now, the importance of this is that I can, even though this is only stored locally in my machine, there was an option to store them centrally, but that only works for Windows authentication, which if that's all you're using, that might be fine. But the aim of having the groups here is you can do things at the group level. So notice I can say right-click evaluate policies, and I could evaluate a set of policies against all the machines in that group. Or I could import policies to all those machines in that group. But the other one that's sort of interesting is I can say, look, give me a new query as well. And notice the color changes down the bottom here. And so if I do that, I can say, look, select add at version or something. Run that, and then this is again just a Management Studio trick. So what it will do is it will run that query against each of those servers. Now, this is fine. If you have a small number of queries that you need to run against a relatively small group of servers, this will be fine. There are third-party versions of things that do a better job of this. So for example, it's not going to track which servers did it run against and which ones didn't it, and retry after a period of time, and it's not going to do any of that. But if you do need to just, I don't know, change a password across a dozen servers or something for a user or something, this is actually a piece of cake, being able to do this, and it tells you the servers and the response back that came from each. Now you can again change how that's done, and so if you look at SQL Server and you look at query results, there are MultiServer Results, and that determines whether it shows you the login name, the server name, and whether it pushes them into a single set of results at the end. If you say no to this one, it just gives you back separate sets of results in the results pane, because under the covers, that's really what's happening. It's just Management Studio sending it to each of those servers and then sort of putting all the stuff together. Look, and the final one I want to talk about today is that I often see people needing to run Management Studio as somebody else. And so most people seem aware that if I right-click in Windows 10 or something like that, I can right-click the link here and then do Run as Administrator. What a lot don't seem to realize, though, is that if I hold Shift and hit the right-click, then I get a whole lot more options. And so notice this includes run as a different user. So if you have the ability to run as that other user, then you can actually fire up a copy of Management Studio, and everything you do inside that would run as that user. Now, the other time that that's really, really useful is if you have something like Microsoft Edge or one of these, the sort of thing you might look to do is you might want to run, I don't know, or Chrome, you might want to sort of run this as somebody else for testing, say, reporting services or things like that, where you don't really want to have to log on, log off as somebody else and so on just to run the code. So look, anyway, that's running us pretty tight time-wise. So look, as I said, there's a whole lot of info in there. As I said, there's an enormous number of these things in there. I would encourage you to have a look at that. It's free. And a couple of other free things. We also generate a whole lot of tools. So if you haven't worked with those, there's SDU Tools. All that does, SDU Tools, is it gives you a script, a couple of scripts, but it basically gives you scripts that I've actually got a database here called database name here, which is kind of cute. But what it does is it adds a whole lot of procs in the SDU Tools schema, and a whole lot of functions, yep, and a whole lot of view or scalar functions as well. There's an enormous amount of code there to just show you how to do various things in SQL Server. And particularly if you're starting, you might find this gives you a wealth of information on how to do these things. That comes out pretty much monthly at the moment, and again, they're free. So look, thanks for your time. I've put contact details there. So Greg, my blog's there, the links for the book and the tools, and just if there's any questions, Warwick.
Okay, so yes, thank you very much, Greg. For those of you who are online and you haven't posted any already, get your typing fingers out and shoot through if you've got any questions. We do have a couple of minutes left for the session. So while we wait for a few questions to come through, first off, I would like to say thank you very much, Greg, for this very informative session. As I mentioned at the start of the session, this has been recorded and will be made available on the DBA Fundamentals archive website within a couple of days' time. So do we have any questions coming through from anybody? At this stage, Greg, it looks like you've covered.
All good, all overwhelmed. Okay, yeah, yes, not a problem.
Very much so. So if there aren't any questions, and we will give a couple of minutes, stay tuned for next month's session, same time, second Tuesday of the month, 12:30 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. For those that joined late, just another quick call out, if you are local here and you want to go to either of the two upcoming SQL Saturdays, make sure that you register for SQL Saturday Melbourne on the 30th of June or SQL Saturday Sydney 1 week later on, I believe it was the 7th of July. So with that, we've got a comment come through. Greg, thank you very much. Great session.
Cool, awesome.
All right,
thanks
everybody.
All.
Thank you for your time.
And hopefully, if you get to SQL Saturday, come and say hi.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.